their laughter replaced by nervous whispers. Every heart beat faster with the sense that the ancestors' warning was nearing its fulfillment. It was during this season that a weary traveler stumbled into the village. He was gaunt, his clothes torn, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. He carried no goods, no weapons, only his own trembling body. When the villagers gave him water and a seat by the fire, his story spilled out in broken fragments. His home lay in a village to the east, once allied with Okuta through marriage and trade. But now, he said, it was gone, burned to the ground by raiders. Not strangers, but men from another neighboring clan. Men who had once been welcomed as brothers. The raiders claimed that the land by the river belonged to them, and blood was the only language they knew. They came at night, the traveler whispered, his voice breaking. We never thought they would turn on us. They killed without mercy. They said more villages would follow. His words spread like fire through Okuta. Panic stirred the people, confirming their worst fears. The prophecy of the bleeding statue was taking form, and the blood it shed was beginning to flow in reality. Some cried that they must flee before the raiders reached them. Others demanded weapons, arguing that only strength could save them. The council of elders met in secret, debating long into the night under the flickering light of palm oil lamps. Adekunle sat outside that meeting, restless and alert. His father, Ogunle the hunter, was among the elders, and he knew their caution too well. They would argue for patience, for more rituals, for appeasing the ancestors with offerings. But Adekunle's blood burned with urgency. He felt in his bones that waiting would only invite disaster. His dreams had grown darker in recent nights. Visions of flames devouring huts, of arrows piercing flesh, of himself standing on a hill surrounded by cries of war. Each time he awoke drenched in sweat, his chest tight with both fear and a strange sense of destiny. The next morning, Baba Irako summoned him. The elder's hut was dim, the air heavy with incense smoke. The diviner's eyes were red, not from tears but from lack of sleep. Adekunle, he said gravely, the spirits speak to me in troubled voices. They show me fire and shadow, but they also show me you. You carry the weight of our ancestors' gaze. Tell me, my son, do you fear this path? Adekunle hesitated, feeling the enormity of the question. I fear only that my people will perish while we wait for signs, he replied. Baba Irako closed his eyes and nodded slowly. Then you must be the one to prepare us. But know this, the burden is heavy, and it will demand sacrifice greater than you can imagine. With the elders' reluctant blessing, Adekunle began to act. He rallied the young men of the village, teaching them to sharpen their spears, to practice with bows in the clearing beyond the fields. Many were inexperienced, more accustomed to herding than to fighting, but Adekunle's determination ignited something within them. At night, they lit small fires in the forest and trained in secret, for the elders still counseled caution and negotiation. Yet whispers of war, carried by the wind, only grew louder. Strangers were seen at the edges of the forest, watching, then vanishing into the trees. A trader passing through spoke of villages to the north fortifying their borders, of alliances being formed in haste. Even the griots sang darker songs, tales of brother turning against brother, of ancestors weeping for the folly of men. Everywhere Adekunle turned, the world seemed to echo the crack in the statue's chest, a fracture widening, threatening to split the land apart. One night, as Adekunle sat by the statue, he placed his palm upon the cold stone, feeling the dried blood that still streaked its face. The moon hung above, full and luminous, bathing the square in silver light. He whispered aloud, Oromia, great ancestor, if you truly weep for us, then show me the path. Give me strength to protect our people. For a moment, the night was silent. Then, a sudden gust of wind rustled through the baobab's branches, and Adekunle thought he heard a low murmur, like a voice carried by the air. It was not clear, yet it filled him with a strange certainty the ancestors were listening. The following day, the elders finally broke their silence. The council gathered the villagers and announced that emissaries would be sent to neighboring clans to seek peace through dialogue. Many cheered this decision, clinging to the hope that bloodshed could be avoided. But Adekunle stood apart, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with doubt. He respected the elders. Yet in his heart, he knew words alone would not halt the tide that was rising. He had seen too much in his dreams, heard too much in the whispers of those who had fled their burning homes. When the emissaries departed, Adekunle and his companions continued their preparations in secret. They practiced moving silently through the forest, signaling with bird calls, watching the trails for signs of raiders. At first, their efforts felt like play, but as days passed, the weight of purpose settled upon them. They were no longer mere villagers. They were becoming guardians, bound not only by fear, but by the fierce determination to defend Okuta when the time came. And come it would. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, a runner arrived at the village, breathless and wounded. His arms bore cuts, his legs streaked with dirt and blood. He collapsed at the square. Gasping out his tale, another village closer this time had been attacked. Their huts were burning even as he spoke. He had barely escaped with his life. A hush fell over Okuta as his words echoed into the night. The statue loomed silently, its cracked chest gleaming in the fading light. It no longer wept, but its silence was heavier than any voice. The people looked to Baba Irako, to the elders, to Adekunle, each desperate for guidance. And in that silence, Adekunle knew the whispers of war were no longer whispers. They were drumbeat, growing louder, drawing nearer, ready to strike at the heart of Okuta. The night after the wounded runner staggered into Okuta, the village did not sleep. Fires burned in the square, and families huddled together, whispering prayers to the ancestors. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and fear, as if war itself was already at their gates. Baba Irako sat beside the cracked statue, his head bowed, muttering incantations no one could hear. The elders gathered nearby, their faces pale in the flickering firelight, debating in hushed but frantic tones. Would the raiders strike soon? Would the emissaries return with peace? Or would their absence mean that hope had already been buried in blood? Days passed without word. The emissaries who had been sent to speak of peace did not return. Each morning, the villagers looked toward the forest paths, hoping to see familiar faces carrying good news. Each evening, they returned home with heavier hearts. The silence of the paths spoke louder than any words. Adekunle's fears hardened into certainty. He began to patrol the edges of the village with the young men he had trained, their spears sharpened, their eyes scanning the shadows. What began as secret preparation was now necessity. Even the elders could no longer deny that danger was closing in. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the land in hues of blood, the sound of distant drums reached Okuta. At first faint, like a heartbeat beneath the earth, then louder, heavier, until the very ground seemed to tremble with their rhythm. The people froze. These were not the drums of celebration, not the joyous rhythms of harvest or marriage. These were the drums of war, deep, unrelenting, echoing across the plains with the promise of violence. Mothers clutched their children. Men tightened their grips on spears, and the goats bleated wildly, sensing the terror that spread like fire through the village. Baba Irako lifted his staff and spoke with urgency. The drums are not ours. They are the drums of our enemies. The blood of the statue has spoken truth. They come. His words broke the fragile hope that lingered among the people. Panic threatened to rise, but Adekunle stepped forward, his voice steady though his heart raced. "Do not tremble before shadows," he called. "The ancestors are with us. The statue weeps for us not because we are doomed, but because we are chosen. We will stand. We will fight. We will protect Okuta." His words struck like sparks in dry grass, igniting courage in the young men around him. They shouted in agreement, lifting their spears to the sky. That night, the war council met openly. The elders, for all their caution, could no longer pretend peace was possible. They entrusted Adekunle with the task of leading the village's defense, for his spirit had already rallied the youth. Though heavy with responsibility, he accepted, knowing that his dreams, his visions, and the cracked statue itself had been preparing him for this role. The people spent the night fortifying their homes, weaving barriers of thorn branches, digging shallow pits along the paths, sharpening every blade they owned. The women prepared healing herbs and charms, their voices rising in chants that carried into the starry sky. The drums outside the village grew louder with each passing night, sometimes near, sometimes far, as though the enemy circled, testing their strength, watching from the shadows. Scouts sent by Adekunle returned with grim reports. Torches seen in the forest, abandoned farms charred by fire, strange symbols carved into trees to mark territory. The raiders were close, perhaps closer than anyone wished to believe. On the third night of drums, a scream shattered the air. A sentry had spotted figures moving in the darkness near the northern fields. Adekunle and his band rushed toward the sound, spears glinting in the moonlight. The forest seemed alive with movement, shadows flitting between the trees. A spear whistled through the air and struck the ground near Adekunle's feet. He raised his weapon and shouted, "To arms!" The clash came swiftly, like lightning splitting the sky. The raiders poured from the trees, fierce and relentless. Their bodies were painted in ash and blood, their eyes wild with fury. They carried torches, bows, and machetes, their chants rising like the growl of beasts. Adekunle met them head-on, his spear striking true, his companions fighting at his side. The night erupted in chaos, the clang of metal, the crack of wood, the cries of men locked in deadly struggle. Flames leapt as torches struck thatched roofs, and the smell of smoke mingled with the sharp tang of blood. Baba Irako stood at the center of the village, raising his staff to the sky, calling upon the ancestors. His voice boomed over the clash of war, summoning spirits of protection. Some swore they saw shadows moving among the fighters, unseen hands deflecting blows, unseen forces pushing back the raiders. The cracked statue glistened in the firelight, its face dark and solemn, as if bearing witness to the bloodshed it had foretold. The battle raged until dawn. Many fell, both villager and raider, their lifeblood soaking into the red earth. Yet when the first light of morning broke, the raiders retreated, their drums fading into silence. Okuta had endured, though scarred and grieving. Huts smoldered, the wounded cried out in pain, and families wept over their dead. But the village still stood. Adekunle, bloodied but unbroken, lifted his spear to the rising sun. His voice cracked with exhaustion, yet carried the strength of conviction. "This is only the beginning," he said. "The ancestors have shown us the truth. The storm is not yet past, but we will not fall. We will rise again and again until Okuta is safe." The villagers, weary and mourning, raised their voices in unison. They had tasted the edge of destruction, and yet they lived. The statue remained silent, its chest split, its face streaked with old blood. It had warned them, and now it stood as a reminder of what lay ahead. The drums of conflict had begun, and Okuta was forever changed. The smoke from the battle lingered over Okuta for days, a heavy shroud that clung to the village like a curse. The cries of the wounded echoed through the night, and the wails of the grieving filled the dawn. Women rubbed ashes upon their foreheads as signs of mourning, while men sat in silence, sharpening spears that had already tasted blood. Children, once carefree, now woke in the dark with nightmares, clutching their mothers as though afraid the raiders would return at any moment. The air itself seemed burdened, as though the ancestors' sorrow weighed upon every breath. Adekunle moved among his people with a heart both heavy and resolute. He helped lift the wounded, carried water to the healers, and stood with families as they buried their dead beneath the baobab groves. Each grave cut into him like a blade, yet each also hardened his resolve. He had survived the first clash, but survival alone was not enough. He could see it in the eyes of his people. Fear had burrowed deep, and unless something stronger replaced it, Okuta would crumble from within even before the raiders struck again. One evening, when the sun dipped low and painted the sky crimson, Adekunle sat before the cracked statue, staring into its lifeless stone eyes. He thought of the blood that had once wept from it, of the omen that had brought them here. He whispered, "Why do you cry for us, Ancestor? Is it because we are doomed, or because you know we are capable of more?" The wind stirred gently, carrying the scent of smoke from the still smoldering huts, but no answer came. Yet deep inside, Adekunle felt a stirring, a faint echo of the same certainty that had driven him into battle. The ancestors were not silent. They had spoken already, and now it was up to the living to act. The elders, weary with loss, finally called for another council. Baba Irako presided, his old eyes clouded with exhaustion, yet still burning with wisdom. "The raiders will return," he said gravely. "The drums we heard were not meant to break us in one night, but to weaken us slowly, to gnaw at our spirit until we are hollow. We must prepare not just our weapons, but our hearts." Some elders spoke of sending messengers farther afield, seeking alliances with villages that had not yet been touched by the spreading war. Others argued that trust was folly, that betrayal was already in the air, and that Okuta must stand alone. Adekunle listened, but his patience wore thin. "While we debate, they gather strength," he said sharply. "I have seen it. Scouts whisper of fires to the north, of villages burned in silence. If we wait, we will be surrounded. We need allies, yes, but we also need to show that we are not prey. We must strike before the storm swallows us whole." His words divided the council. Some nodded, their faces stern with agreement. Others shook their heads, fearing his boldness would drag Okuta into greater ruin. That night, sleep evaded Adekunle. He walked the village in silence, hearing the distant cries of the wounded and the low hum of prayers from grieving mothers. At the edge of the forest, he encountered Baba Irako, who stood gazing into the dark as though he could see beyond the trees. "You speak like a leader," the old man said without turning. Adekunle lowered his head. "I speak like a man who fears for his people." Baba Uroko similet faintly. The two are not so different. Then his expression darkened. "But you must remember, Adekunle, war is not only fought with spears. Shadows move faster than blades, and betrayal cuts deeper than wounds. Be careful whom you trust." His warning soon proved true. 2 days later, a boy from the village disappeared. He had been tending goats near the river, and when the herd returned without him, panic spread. Search parties scoured the forest, calling his name, but found nothing but a broken charm lying in the mud. Some whispered that the raiders had taken him. Others muttered darker suspicions, that perhaps someone within Okuta had betrayed them, guiding the enemy's eyes toward their children. Fear grew sharper, turning neighbor against neighbor, each eyeing the other with suspicion. It was then that the statue once more gave a sign. A woman fetching water at dawn screamed, waking the entire village. When they gathered at the square, they saw the stone figure of Ornmia streaked again with red. Not tears this time, but a dark smear across its cracked chest, as though its heart itself bled. Baba Irako fell to his knees, his voice trembling. "The blood of the statue speaks again. Shadows move among us. The enemy is not only at our gates, it is within." The revelation struck Okuta like thunder. If betrayal was among them, how could they stand united? Accusations flew, friendships strained, and trust wavered like a flame in the wind. Adekunle felt the weight pressing harder upon his shoulders. To lead men into battle was one thing. To hold a village together while suspicion tore it apart was another. He knew that if fear consumed them from within, no number of spears could save Okuta from destruction. Yet even as doubt gnawed at the people, Adekunle began to form a plan. He He spoke quietly to those he trusted most, his companions who had fought at his side, who had seen blood on the fields and had not faltered. Together, they would watch the village in silence, seeking the shadow that moved among them. They would uncover the traitor, if one truly existed, and bring the truth into the light before it devoured them all. And so, as the village tried to sleep under the uneasy glow of the moon, Adekunle and his companions moved silently through the huts, through the fields, their eyes searching the dark, their ears attuned to every rustle of leaves. The night was long. The days after the first battle stretched like shadows across Okuta, heavy with grief, yet burning with a strange new fire. The villagers had buried their dead beneath the baobab, marking the graves with carved stones and offerings of food, water, and kola nuts. The women wailed through the night, their cries echoing into the hills, while the men sat in silence, sharpening weapons, staring into the distance with haunted eyes. The air itself seemed charged, as though the spirits of the fallen lingered among the huts, watching, whispering, waiting for vengeance. Adekunle carried their weight like a mantle across his shoulders. Though many praised him as the savior of Okuta, he felt no triumph. He had seen too much: the lifeless bodies of his friends, the smoldering homes, the blood soaking into the earth. At night he dreamed of their faces, their eyes staring into his, asking silently if their deaths had been worth it. Each morning he woke before dawn, sweat dripping from his brow, his chest heavy with guilt. Yet in his heart he knew that the ancestors had not chosen him for peace, but for struggle, and there was no turning back. One evening, as the crimson sun bled across the horizon, Adekunle returned to the cracked statue. He knelt before it, his hands trembling as he placed a calabash of palm wine at its base. "Oromia," he whispered, "you warned us, and we have obeyed, even if it cost me my life." His words silenced the room, and for a long moment the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then Baba Irako nodded, his old eyes glistening. "So it must be. The ancestors have chosen, and the path is clear." Preparations were made swiftly. Adekunle gathered a small band of companions, warriors, hunters, and even a few young women who refused to remain behind. They painted their faces with chalk, tied charms around their necks, and carried the blessings of their families. Before dawn, where the cries of unseen animals echoed through the night, they waded through rivers swollen with rain, their feet sinking into the mud, leeches clinging to their skin. At abandoned farms, they found signs of destruction: burned huts, trampled fields, the silence of lives erased. More than once, they spotted enemy scouts moving swiftly through the trees, and only by cunning and caution did they avoid ambush. Yet despite the danger, Adekunle felt a strange strength coursing through him, as though unseen hands steadied his steps. Each time his courage wavered, he remembered the crack in the statue's chest, the blood on its face, and the voice of the wind commanding him to lead. At last, they reached a surviving village to the west, larger than Okuta, its people wary and armed. The chief, a stern man named Alyawo, received them with suspicion. "Why should we trust you?" he demanded. Adekunle spoke not only to the chief, but to the gathered people, telling them of the bleeding statue, of the prophecy, of the battle already fought. He spoke of the ancestors who watched and wept, and of the hope that still flickered like a small flame in the darkness. The villagers listened, and when he finished, silence hung in the air. Then, slowly, voices rose, first a few, then many, pledging their spears and their strength to the fight. For the first time since the statue had wept, Adekunle felt a glimmer of hope. Perhaps the ancestors had not cursed them, but had given them the burden of unity, of leading a people fractured by fear into one force strong enough to resist the storm. Yet even in that moment of triumph, he knew the path ahead was steep and cruel. For each ally gained, there would be enemies lurking in the shadows. For every pledge of loyalty, there would be betrayal waiting like a serpent in the grass. As he lay awake that night beneath the stars, Adekunle placed his hand upon the earth and whispered again to Oromia. I will lead, even when I bleed, he vowed. But do not let me walk alone. Stand with me, and I will carry your burden until the last breath leaves my body. The wind stirred, carrying with it the distant echo of drums, not of celebration, not of peace, but of gathering war. And Adekunle understood that the ancestors had given him not just a warning, but a destiny. The days following the second great clash were filled with a silence heavier than thunder. The fields of Okuta lay scarred with footprints and bloodstains, and the smoke of smoldering huts still lingered in the air. Women sang low mourning songs as they buried the dead, their voices weaving sorrow into the fabric of the village. Children sat quietly, their eyes too wide, as if they had seen too much of the world far too soon. Adekunle walked among them like a man carrying invisible chains. He had fought with all his might, had stood at the front lines as the statue seemed to watch him, yet the cost of survival gnawed at his soul. Each grave dug felt like a failure, each wail of grief a reminder that even victory left wounds that could not be mended by spears alone. Baba Iroko, who had stood in the square during the battle with his staff raised, seemed older now. His steps were slower, his voice raspier, his eyes filled with shadows. When Adekunle asked him what the ancestors had said since the fight, the elder shook his head in sorrow. They are silent, my son. I pray, I chant, I burn offerings, but their voices do not reach me. It is as if they have turned their backs, or as if they wait for something more. These words troubled Adekunle more than the sight of the raiders' blades. The ancestors had been their guide, their strength, their unseen wall against destruction. If they had fallen silent now, what hope remained? The village tried to mend itself. Men rebuilt huts with trembling hands. Women ground grain in silence. The children fetched water with downcast eyes. Yet beneath this rhythm of survival pulsed a current of unease. Scouts reported movement in the forests, signals left behind by enemy war parties. Traders who once came bearing cloth and salt now avoided Okuta entirely, fearful of being caught in a war they did not understand. Even the animals seemed unsettled. The goats grew restless at dusk. The chickens refused to roost near the square, and the dogs barked at shadows that passed too swiftly to be seen. One night, Adekunle found himself drawn once again to the statue. The moon was thin, a sliver of silver above the baobab. The cracked chest of the stone ancestor glimmered faintly, its old streaks of dried blood dark against the pale rock. Adekunle knelt before it, his heart heavy. Oromia, he whispered, you chose us, did you not? You bled to warn us. You cracked to show us the burden we must bear. Why then do you turn away now, when we need you most? His voice broke, the weight of his grief pressing against his chest. He had led his people in a battle, but he could not shake the image of those who had fallen under his command. For the first time, doubt threatened to drown him. Perhaps he was not chosen at all. Perhaps he was simply another man caught in the tide of history, destined to be broken by it. As he sat in silence, a faint breeze stirred the leaves of the baobab. He thought he heard a whisper, but it was fleeting, vanishing before he could grasp its meaning. Frustration burned in his veins. Rising to his feet, he struck the ground with his spear. If you will not speak, then I will act, he declared. If you will not guide, then I will carve the path myself. My people will not perish while I live. His words carried into the night, bold yet edged with despair. The next morning, the scouts returned with grim news. The enemy was not retreating, as some had hoped, but gathering. Their drums had been heard again, this time not in the distance, but much closer, their rhythms steady, confident, like a predator circling its prey. Rumors spread quickly that the raiders were forging alliances with other clans, that their numbers were growing, that Okuta would soon be surrounded. Panic threatened to rise once more. But Adekunle's voice steadied the people. He called the young men together, urging them to hold fast, to sharpen their weapons and fortify their defenses. His resolve, though born from doubt, became a beacon for others. They looked to him not only as a warrior, but as the leader fate had thrust upon them. In the quiet moments, when no one watched, Adekunle wrestled with fear. He felt the silence of the ancestors like a wound that refused to heal. He remembered Baba Irako's weary eyes, the old man's words that perhaps the spirits waited for something more. But what more could they demand? How much blood must be spilled before the voices of the ancestors returned? That night, a strange dream came to Adekunle. He stood in a vast plain of red earth, beneath a sky filled with smoke and fire. In the distance, he saw the stone statue, but it was no longer small and weathered. It towered above him, immense and terrifying, its eyes glowing with molten light. From its cracked chest poured not blood, but rivers of fire, flooding the earth, consuming everything in its path. Adekunle fell to his knees, crying out. But the statue did not weep this time. It roared, a sound that split the heavens, and in its roar he heard a message. Sacrifice must be made. He awoke, gasping, sweat pouring down his face, his body trembling with the weight of the vision. The following morning, Adekunle shared nothing of his dream. To speak of it would only spread fear, and fear was already a fire that threatened to consume his people. Yet the words burned in his mind. Sacrifice must be made. He did not know what it meant, but he felt certain that the silence of the ancestors was not absence, but expectation. They waited for something he had not yet given. The question was what or who must be sacrificed for Okuta to endure? The village of Okuta stood in a fragile stillness after the battles that had shaken it to the core. The air carried the smell of ash and smoke, lingering reminders of fire that had scorched the outer huts. The drums of the raiders had faded for now, but their echoes lived in the hearts of the villagers. Every dawn was heavy with uncertainty, every night alive with fear of torches returning from the darkness of the forest. Yet in that silence, a deeper unease grew. It was not merely the threat of enemies beyond their borders, but the shadow of doubt gnawing from within. Families who had lost sons began to question the will of the ancestors. Some whispered that the cracked statue was not a warning, but a curse, that Ormia had turned against his people. The faith that had bound Okuta together for generations now trembled on the edge of collapse. Adekunle felt the weight of these whispers more than any blade. He had risen as a leader in battle, his courage lifting the spirits of the youth. But he knew that victory on the field was only part of the struggle. If the village lost faith in their ancestors, they would be defeated before another spear was raised. And so, one evening as the moon waned, he walked to the square where the statue loomed. It stood cracked and silent, its stone face still streaked with dried blood. Adekunle knelt before it, his hands resting on the earth, his voice low but firm. "Great Ormia," he whispered, "if your tears were a warning, then guide us now. If your chest cracked with sorrow, then show us how to heal it. Do not let your children drown in doubt." He closed his eyes and felt the cool wind sweep across his skin, carrying the rustle of baobab leaves. For a moment, he thought he heard nothing but silence, but then, like the faintest whisper in the depth of his mind, there came a voice, soft yet commanding. "You must bind them in blood and oath, so that no shadow divides them. Only then will they endure what is coming." The words shook him to his core. He rose and went straight to Baba Irako, who sat by the fire outside his hut, his staff across his lap. Adekunle relayed the whisper he had heard, the weight of the message heavy on his tongue. The old diviner listened, his eyes half closed, and when Adekunle finished, Baba Irako nodded slowly. "The ancestors do not speak lightly," he said. "An oath sealed in blood is not only a promise between men, but a covenant between the living and the dead. If we are to survive, we must renew the bond that ties Okuta to its roots. The people must swear before the statue itself that they will stand as one, no matter the cost. The following day, if we fall to those, then even if no spear touches us, we are already dead. The ancestors demand that we bind ourselves as one people, one body, one spirit. We will swear an oath tonight, sealed in blood, so that our children and our children's children will never forget." A murmur spread among the villagers. Some feared what such an oath might demand. Others felt relief at the chance to restore their broken faith. As night fell, torches were lit, and the drums beat not in warning this time, but in rhythm with the heartbeat of the village. One by one, the families came forward. A shallow cut was made upon each right palm, and with hands pressed to the cracked stone of Ormia, they swore aloud, "By the blood of our ancestors, by the earth that holds their bones, we stand as one. No enemy shall divide us, no shadow shall break us. If we betray this oath, may the ancestors turn their faces away." When it was Adekunal's turn, he stepped forward with steady stride, his eyes fixed on the statue's face. The cut was made upon his palm, and as his blood touched the cold stone, not with crimson this time, but with a faint silver sheen, as though moonlight itself bled from the stone. The villagers gasped, some falling to their knees. Baba Irako lifted his staff high. Behold, mothers lifted their children high, men raised their spears, and women sang songs of resilience. For the first time since the statue's weeping, the village felt united. The raiders had not vanished. Their drums would beat again, and blood would yet be spilled upon the red earth. But now, Okuta would face it not as a trembling village, but as one body, one spirit, one oath bound by the ancestors themselves. And somewhere in the depths of the night, in the silence between the drums of celebration, Adekunal thought he heard the whisper once more, faint, like the echo of a memory. "The oath is the root, but the storm is yet to come. Be strong, child of Okuta, for your true trial is only beginning." The days after the second battle fell upon Okuta like a heavy cloak. The village was alive, but it breathed with pain and exhaustion. The wounded lay in their huts. Adekunal walked through the village with a weight pressing on his chest heavier than any armor. Men saluted him as he passed. Women whispered his name, and children looked at him with a mix of awe and fear. They called him the chosen of the ancestors, the one who stood firm when the raiders came. Yet Adekunal felt hollow. Each life lost gnawed at him. Each cry of grief echoed in his mind like a drum he could not silence. He had fought with courage, but courage had not saved them from fire, nor had it healed the wounds carved into their community. At night, he sat before the statue, staring into its blank stone eyes. "Why do you not speak?" he whispered. "You wept blood to warn us. You cracked to show us war was coming. And now, when I need your voice the most, you are silent. Have I failed you? Have I failed my people?" The wind rustled through the baobab branches, but no voice answered, no sign appeared. Adekunal clenched his fists, torn between faith and despair. The elders met daily, their discussions growing heated. Some argued for abandoning the village altogether, fleeing deeper into the forest to escape the raiders. Others demanded retribution, to march upon the neighboring clans before they could regroup. Baba Irako, weary and older than the hills, urged patience and ritual. "The ancestors are still with us," he said, though his voice trembled as if he doubted his own words. "We must call upon them again, remind them of our devotion." But the younger men, scarred from battle, spat at this counsel. "We cannot eat prayers," one said. "We cannot shield our children with songs. We need action." Adekunal stood between these worlds, torn by their voices. His dreams still came, but now they were darker, filled with shadows that swallowed light, with faceless warriors who fought endlessly, neither winning nor losing. Once, he dreamed of the statue crumbling into dust, and he awoke with such fear that he rushed to the square to see it still standing. Another time, he dreamed of a river running red, and two figures, one calling to him, the other pulling him back. Yet when he reached for them, they dissolved into mist. On the seventh night after the battle, a strange stillness came over Okuta. The wind ceased, the night birds fell silent, and the moon hung unnaturally bright. Baba Irako gathered the people at the square, insisting on a great ritual to awaken the ancestors. The drummers struck their skins with desperate hands. The singers' raised voices cracked with grief, and offerings of goat and wine were placed before the cracked statue. Smoke rose in twisting columns, carrying prayers into the night sky. Adekunle stood at the front, his spear planted in the earth, his eyes fixed on the stone face that had haunted him for weeks. The chants grew louder, the fire roared higher, but the statue did not move, nor did it bleed. Then, at the very height of the ritual, a sudden gust of wind tore through the square, extinguishing the flames. The drums fell silent, the singers gasped, and darkness cloaked the people. For a moment, only the stars lit their faces. Then came a sound, not words, not music, but a low, resonant hum that seemed to rise from the ground itself. The villagers clutched one another, trembling. Adekunle alone stepped forward, and in the hum he felt a presence, vast and ancient, pressing against his chest like the weight of eternity. But just as suddenly as it came, it vanished. The wind stilled, the stars seemed ordinary again, and the statue remained silent. Some wept. He knew the silence of the ancestors did not mean abandonment. It meant that the choice was now his, and his alone. He could wait for signs that might never come, or he could take the burden into his own hands. The statue had warned them of war, but it would not fight for them. That task belonged to the living. And so, as the dawn began to break, Adekunle whispered to the wind, not as a plea, but as a vow. If the ancestors will not guide me, then I will guide myself, and I will not let Okuta fall. The dawn after the last skirmish came heavy with silence. The smoke of burned huts still hung low over Okuta, clinging to the trees, seeping into every breath. The survivors moved like shadows through the ruins of their homes, tending to the wounded, gathering the dead. The cries of grieving women echoed through the square, their voices rising like a mournful chorus to the heavens. Yet even in grief, there was a strange stillness, as if the village itself held its breath. The statue of Ormia stood at the center, its cracked chest and blood-stained face glimmering in the pale light. The villagers no longer approached it with the innocent reverence of before. Now, when they looked at the stone, they saw not only their ancestor but the shadow of war and the weight of destiny pressing down upon them. Adekunle stood before the statue, his body bruised, his arms trembling from exhaustion, his spirit torn between pride and despair. He had fought with every ounce of strength, and his people had survived, but survival no longer felt like victory. Too many lay beneath the earth, their blood mingling with the soil that once nurtured crops and children's laughter. He touched the dried streaks of blood on the statue's face, whispering in a voice raw with anguish, "Why must it be this way, Ormia? Why must our blood water this ground? If this is the path of the ancestors, then tell me, what is the end?" Behind him, Baba Irako approached slowly, leaning heavily on his staff. His face was lined with sorrow, but his eyes burned with the clarity of one who had seen visions too vivid to deny. "My son," the elder said softly, "the blood that stains the statue is not only of sorrow. It is a binding. It ties us to the truth of who we are. The ancestors do not weep without reason. They show us the pain ahead, yes, but also the strength we must summon. We are not cursed. We are being tested." Adekunle turned, his jaw tight. But how many must die before this test is complete? How much more can our people endure? Baba Irako laid a hand on his shoulder. Endurance itself is the answer. To carry the weight of suffering and yet not fall, that is the path of the chosen. That night, when the fires burned low and the wailing subsided into weary silence, Adekunle gathered the young men who still had strength in their bodies. They sat in a circle beneath the baobab tree, their faces hardened by loss. Adekunle spoke with the calm intensity of one who no longer sought only to fight, but to lead. "We cannot remain as we are, waiting for the enemy to strike again. The drums of war will not stop beating until we silence them. The ancestors have shown us blood, but they have also shown us the will to endure. If Okuta is to survive, we must carry the fight beyond our walls." His words struck deep, and though fear flickered in their eyes, the men nodded. They understood. The days of being only defenders were over. They would become hunters in this war, guided by the will of their ancestors. Baba Irako blessed them before dawn, chanting over charms of bone and cowrie shells, painting their bodies with ash and red earth. "You do not walk alone," he told them. "Every step you take, the shadows of your forefathers move with you. Remember their courage. Remember their sacrifice." As the first light broke across the horizon, Adekunle and his band departed into the forest, the village watching in silence. Mothers wept quietly. Children clung to their fathers, but no one tried to stop them. They knew the fate of Okuta now rested not only in the walls of their village, but in the courage of those who walked out into the unknown. The forest closed around them, vast and silent, its ancient trees looming like silent witnesses. They moved carefully, listening for the sound of drums, for the faintest crack of a branch that might betray an enemy's presence. For 2 days, they traveled, following the tracks of raiders, finding the charred remains of farms, the bones of cattle left to rot, and once, the shallow graves of villagers whose blood had been spilled without mercy. Each sight hardened their resolve, binding them more tightly to their cause. Adekunle felt the weight of every life lost pressing on his shoulders, but instead of breaking him, it steeled his spirit. On the third night, as they camped beside a river, Adekunle dreamed again of the statue. This time, the face of Ormia was no longer weeping, but watching him with fierce, unyielding eyes. The crack in the statue's chest glowed like fire, and Adekunle felt it burn within his own heart. A voice rose in his dream, deep and resonant, neither cruel nor gentle, but commanding. "Blood binds you, Adekunle, the blood of your fathers, the blood of your people. Do not run from it. Do not curse it. Carry it. It will carry you." He awoke with a start, his body drenched in sweat, but his spirit clearer than it had ever been. The ancestors were not only warning him, they were calling him to bear the weight of their legacy. At dawn, he told his companions of the dream. They listened in silence, then one by one placed their hands upon his shoulders, acknowledging him not only as a warrior among them, but as their leader, chosen by the ancestors themselves. And so, beneath the rising sun, by the flowing river that had once quenched the thirst of their forefathers, Adekunle swore aloud, "I will not let their blood be wasted. I will carry the weight of the ancestors, and I will lead us through this storm. By the blood that has been shed, by the earth that drinks it, I swear we will not fall." His companions echoed his vow, their voices fierce and unshaken. Only the quiet murmur of prayers rising like smoke into the starless sky. Families lit fires at their doorways, setting calabashes of food and palm wine before them as offerings to the spirits. Baba Irako, frail with age yet still strong in spirit, walked the square with his staff, whispering blessings upon every child he passed. Adekunle sat before the cracked statue, his body weary, his mind burdened with the faces of those already lost. He placed his palm against the stone, feeling its cold surface. The dried streaks of blood still marked its cheeks, and for the first time, he thought he saw its eyes glisten once more. "If this is the end," he whispered, "let it be one of honor. Do not let my people fall into dust." At dawn, the drums began, louder than ever before. They shook the ground and rattled the hearts of even the bravest. The enemy came in waves, torches raised, voices chanting with fury. Okuta's warriors formed a line at the edge of the fields, their spears glinting in the pale light, their shields steady though their hands trembled. Adekunle stood at the center, his chest bare, his face marked with white chalk and ash, the symbols of both warrior and sacrifice. He lifted his spear to the sky and shouted, "Okuta will not bow. The ancestors walk with us. Today we fight not for land, but for the blood that binds us. The crack of spears against shields, the smell of sweat and smoke and blood thick in the air. The enemy pressed hard, their numbers overwhelming, pushing Okuta back step by step. Fires spread across the fields, choking the sky with black smoke. Adekunle fought like one possessed, his spear striking true again and again, his body moving with a strength beyond his own. Those who fought beside him swore that shadows moved at his back, figures unseen but felt, ancestors lending their strength to their chosen son. Yet even with that power, the tide threatened to swallow them whole. In the midst of the carnage, a terrible cry rose from the village square. The cracked statue, the ancient guardian of Okuta, shuddered violently as though alive. Its chest split wide with a thunderous crack, and from the fissure poured a stream of crimson, thick and flowing like a wound torn open. The blood soaked the earth at its base, spreading across the ground in dark rivulets. The villagers gasped, some falling to their knees even as battle raged around them. Baba Uroko, his eyes wide with both terror and awe, raised a staff and cried out, "The Ancestor speaks. This is the last cry of Oromia. Stand, children of Okuta. Stand, for your blood is one with his." The vision of the bleeding statue sent a surge of fire through the warriors' veins. They roared with renewed fury, driving back the enemy with a force that seemed born of more than mortal strength. Spears found their marks, shields held firm, and for every man of Okuta that fell, 2 enemies were struck down. Adekunle, his body covered in wounds, pressed forward through the storm of battle until he faced the enemy's war chief. Their clash was like thunder, steel against steel, will against will. At last, with a cry that echoed across the fields, Adekunle drove his spear into the chief's chest, felling him where he stood. The sight of their leader's fall broke the spirit of the invaders. Their chants faltered, their drums stuttered, and then they fled into the forest, abandoning their torches and weapons. The fields grew quiet but for the groans of the wounded and the crackle of dying fires. Okuta had endured, broken, bloodied but unbowed. When the battle was done, the people gathered once more before the statue. It stood in silence, its chest shattered, its face streaked with the final rivers of blood. Baba Irako knelt before it, tears streaming down his aged cheeks. The Ancestor has given his last warning, his last gift. His blood is our blood. His strength is our strength. We must never forget. Adekunle stood beside him, his spear broken, his body trembling with exhaustion. The people looked to him not just as a warrior, but as a leader, one who had carried them through fire and shadow into the light of survival. As night fell, a strange peace settled upon the village. The drums of war were silent, the enemy scattered, and though Okuta bore scars that would never fade, it still stood. Children slept in their mothers' arms, the wounded were tended with care, and the fires of destruction were replaced with the gentle glow of hearths. Above them, the sky cleared, revealing stars bright and countless, like the eyes of ancestors watching from beyond. Adekunle gazed at those stars, his heart heavy yet unbroken. He knew the battles of men would never truly end, that war and peace would always circle like hawks over the land. But he also knew that Okuta had been tested and had endured, bound forever to the spirit of Oromia, the Ancestor who had wept for them. The statue's last cry had been heard, and it had saved them from destruction. And so the story of Okuta lived on, carried in the songs of griots, whispered by firesides, told to children yet unborn. The story of the statue that wept blood, the omen that warned of war, and the young warrior who rose to lead his people through darkness into dawn. When the last echoes of battle finally faded, and the war that had torn the land like a wound began to recede, Okuta stood battered but unbroken. Smoke no longer rose from the huts. Though the scars remained upon the walls, the earth, and the hearts of the people. The air that once throbbed with the drums of war now carried the softer sounds of life returning. The lowing of cattle, the laughter of children learning once more to play, the gentle murmur of women pounding yam in their mortars. Yet beneath that fragile peace, there lingered an unshakable memory. The day the ancestors' statue wept blood. The statue still stood beneath the baobab tree, its cracked chest now filled with moss. The crimson stains faded into dark lines. It had not wept again, not since that first dreadful morning. But its silence was no longer feared. Instead, it was revered as the truth of the ancestors, a truth that had warned, a truth that had saved. Whenever the villagers passed it, they bowed their heads, whispering thanks for the protection of Ormia and the unseen spirits who had fought beside them. Adekunle, once the restless son of a hunter, now bore the mantle of leadership. His spear was no longer just a weapon. It was a symbol of the oath he carried to protect his people. He had seen the fire of war, the sorrow of loss, and the burden of command. Yet he had also seen the strength that rose when a village stood together. He had become what the ancestors had chosen, a guardian not just of Okuta's land, but of its spirit. At night, when the moon rose high, he often sat by the statue in silence, his thoughts heavy yet calm. He no longer begged for answers. He had learned that the ancestors spoke not always in words, but in signs, in whispers, in the blood that flows through every living soul. Baba Iriko, old and weary, declared to the people that the ancestors had tested them and found them worthy. The blood of the statue was not a curse, he told them. It was a reminder that our lives are bound to those who came before us. Their tears are our tears, their struggles our struggles, and their strength our strength. We did not fall because we remembered who we are. The villagers carried his words into their daily lives, teaching them to their children, so that no one would forget. And so Okuta rebuilt. Fields were planted anew, songs were sung again at festivals, and the laughter that had once been silenced returned to echo across the plains. Yet in the hearts of the people, the lesson remained clear. The ancestors are never silent. They watch, they guide, and sometimes they weep, not out of despair, but to awaken the living to the dangers that sleep in the shadows. The story of the weeping statue became a tale carried far beyond Okuta, told by griots under starlit skies across many villages. Some doubted, others shuddered, but all who heard it remembered the truth that it carried, that the living and the dead are bound together, and when the balance is broken, the ancestors themselves will bleed to remind their children of the cost of forgetting. In the years that followed, Adekunle grew into an elder himself, his beard touched with gray, his voice heavy with wisdom. He often told the youth of Okuta, "Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the choice to rise when the ancestors call, even when your knees tremble." And when he died, they buried him beside the baobab, so that his spirit might join Ormia and all the guardians who had come before. The statue still stands, weathered by time, its crack deepened but unhealed. Some say that when the wind howls through the baobab branches, it sounds like a low sob, as if the stone remembers. But the people of Okuta no longer fear that sound. They bow their heads, touch the earth, and whisper back, "We hear you. We remember. We endure." Thus ended the tale of the weeping statue, not as a story of despair, but as one of resilience, the story of a people who learned that the ancestors' tears are both warning and blessing, sorrow and strength.